You probably have your smartphone within arm's reach right now, maybe even in your hand as you listen. It's become, well, indispensable, hasn't it? Almost like another limb.
It really has.
Hmm.
Hard to imagine life without it sometimes.
But have you ever stopped to think, I mean, really think, what its constant presence, that little buzzing thing in your pocket, might actually be doing to your brain?
Hmm.
And specifically, what about creativity? You know, that spark, that ability we have to come up with new stuff, solve problems in ways no one thought of before.
It's a huge question, and one we often maybe push aside. We depend on them so much for, well, everything. Info, connection, keeping boredom at bay.
Right.
But their deeper impact, the subtle shifts in how we think, especially our most advanced cognitive skills, like generating truly original ideas, that often goes unexamined. It's easy to miss when it's so gradual.
Totally agree. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. Our mission is to explore this fascinating and honestly pretty crucial piece of research. It asks a very direct question. Does smartphone addiction impact our ability to be creative?
And this isn't just any opinion piece.
No, definitely not. We're unpacking a study, a recent one, published in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience. The authors are Xinyi Li, Yadan Li, Shui Wang, and Weeping Hu. And what makes it so compelling is they used neuroimaging, actually looked inside people's brains while they were trying to be creative.
Yeah, comparing people who show signs of smartphone addiction tendency with those who don't. That comparison is key.
Absolutely. And let's be clear on that up front. This deep dive isn't just about, scrolling Instagram too much.
Right.
The researchers specifically looked at individuals showing a tendency towards addiction. They used a proper scale to identify what they called the Smartphone Addiction Tendency Group, or SAT group.
They weren't diagnosing people in a clinical sense, but identifying a pattern, a leaning towards problematic use.
Exactly. And they compared this SAT group directly with what they termed the healthy control, or HC, individuals, people without that tendency. So they could really try and isolate how this addiction tendency might be messing with creative idea generation right down at the neural level.
Looking at the brain's mechanics.
And why now? Why is this so relevant at this very moment?
Well, think back to 2019, the pandemic. Home isolation. Smartphone use just exploded, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. For many, it became the main lifeline, the only window to the outside world, really.
And we already have stacks of research showing the negative side effects of smartphone addiction on other things. Our attention span's shrinking.
Yep. Memory issues, how we perceive things. That's fairly well documented.
Right. But the specific impact on creative cognition, that ability to think differently, that, as you said, has been kind of a black box, an unexplored area.
Which makes this study incredibly timely. We need to understand if our constant connection is coming at a cognitive cost, especially to something as fundamental as creativity. It really feels like looking beyond the surface convenience, doesn't it? Trying to grasp these maybe slightly unsettling shifts happening in our brains as technology just keeps evolving faster and faster.
Precisely. Okay, so where do we start? Laying the groundwork seems essential.
Yeah, let's do that. First up, when we talk about smartphone addiction in this research context, what are we actually defining? What does that really mean?
Well, in this paper, they define it as a form of behavioral addiction. So not like a substance, but the pattern of behavior becomes compulsive. It's characterized by this excessive dependence, maybe even abuse of the smartphone.
It's more than just heavy use then.
Oh, definitely. It's when that use becomes really hard to control, when it starts negatively impacting other parts of your life, work, relationships, sleep, you name it. Research, people like Panova and Carbonell, Bush, and McCarthy, they've shown that people genuinely struggle to cut back, even when they want to.
I think many of us can relate to that feeling, that difficulty minimizing use. And you mentioned the lockdowns really crank this up.
Dramatically. The study notes how the pandemic and all that home isolation led to a really steep documented rise in these addictive behaviors. Caponetto and colleagues wrote about that surge back in 2021. So we're not talking about a tiny group of people. It's a widespread, growing concern.
And the groundwork for cognitive impact was already there, suggesting other mental functions were affected.
Absolutely. We knew going in that this kind of addiction was linked to issues like impaired attention, changes in perception, and definite memory problems. Studies have shown that.
Yeah.
So the idea that smartphones could affect our brains wasn't out of left field.
Right.
But the specific link to creativity, that advanced cognitive function, that was the big unknown they were tackling.
Okay, so that's the addiction side clearly laid out. Let's flip to the other side of the coin. Creativity. How do scientists even try to measure something that feels so multifaceted, so subjective? What are they actually looking for in a lab setting?
That's a great question because creativity feels so broad. In scientific terms, though, it's often defined as the ability to generate products, ideas, solutions, whatever, that are both original and useful or appropriate. That definition, from Sternberg and Lubar way back in '99, is pretty foundational.
So it's not just about being arty, it's about effective, novel thinking in everyday life, too.
Exactly. It's fundamental problem solving, finding a new way to fix something, brainstorming a project, even figuring out a clever way to use leftovers. It's about generating something new and valuable.
Got it. And within that broad definition, what specific mental gears were these researchers focusing on? What are the key components they zeroed in on?
They really focused on two critical cognitive components. The first one is huge for genuine innovation, overcoming semantic constraints.
Semantic constraints. Okay, break that down for us.
Imagine I give you a brick. Your first thoughts, the easiest ones that pop into your head, are probably things like build a wall, use it as a weapon, maybe smash a window. Those are the common dominant ideas linked to brick in your memory.
Right, the obvious stuff.
Exactly. Overcoming semantic constraints means you have to actively use your cognitive control, your brain's ability to manage attention and suppress impulses to push past those automatic, easy ideas. You have to deliberately inhibit the obvious to make space for something genuinely novel.
Ah, so thinking of the brick as maybe a doorstop
Hmm.
or a paperweight
Yeah,
or grinding it up for pigment.
precisely. You're fighting that initial strong association to find something less common, more original. It requires real mental effort.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's like wrestling with your own brain's default settings. What was the second component?
The second is building unusual associations. This is maybe a bit more free-flowing. It's about spontaneously generating novel connections between concepts that don't usually seem related.
Like connecting two totally different ideas to spark something new.
Kind of, yeah. It's that sort of aha moment sometimes where
Yeah.
you link things in an unexpected way. Think about metaphorical thinking or seeing relationships others miss. But both of these, especially overcoming those constraints, heavily rely on cognitive control. You need that ability to suppress the dominant thoughts and actively search for more remote, novel information.
So flexibility, control, breaking habits.
Oh.
Got it. And we knew smartphone addiction hit basic functions, but this link to advanced creativity and crucially, how the brain mechanisms involved that was the big gap this study aimed to fill.
A massive gap, really, given how central both phones and creativity are. And understanding the brain's role is key. We already had some clues, of course. We knew the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, right at the front of the brain.
The brain's CEO, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. It handles executive functions, self-control, that vital cognitive control we just talked about. And previous studies had already found issues there in people with smartphone addiction, things like less gray matter, weird activation patterns. And the PFC is crucial for that top-down control needed to form novel associations, to steer your thoughts away from the obvious.
Okay, so the PFC is the controller. What about the temporal cortex, more on the sides of the head? What does that do in this creative dance?
The temporal cortex is heavily involved in processing, meaning semantics, and forming those associations between ideas, especially novel ones. Specific parts are really important here, like the temporoparietal junction, or TPJ. That's a key part of the default mode network, or DMN.
The DMN, that's the network that's active when our minds wander, right? Daydreaming and stuff.
Exactly. And counterintuitively, that mind-wandering state is really important for creativity. It allows for that spontaneous, unconstrained thinking. Then you have other temporal areas like the superior temporal gyrus, STG, and middle temporal gyrus, MTG. They're more directly involved in constructing those novel semantic links, connecting concepts in new ways.
So PFC for focus and control. Temporal cortex for meaning and new connections, including that DMN for spontaneous thought. How do they work together? That's where functional connectivity comes in, right? How different brain bits talk to each other.
Precisely. Functional connectivity is all about the communication, the synchronized activity between brain regions. Think of it like teamwork. For creativity, unique patterns of connectivity are vital. Specifically, the interplay, the cooperation between the executive control network, or ECN, which includes parts of the PFC, and drives focused, goal-directed thought.
And the default mode network, DMN, the mind-wandering one.
Right, that dynamic dance between focus control, ECN, and spontaneous association, DMN, is critical.
Yeah.
You need the ECN to suppress the obvious stuff, but you need the DMN to help generate the unusual connections. It's a balancing act.
And we already suspected this communication might be messed up in smartphone addiction.
Yes, exactly. Previous work suggested that smartphone addiction could alter connectivity within the DMN
Mm.
and also disrupt how the DMN interacts with those executive control functions. So the stage was perfectly set for this study to not just look at activity levels, but also how well these crucial creative networks were communicating and coordinating in people with smartphone addiction tendency.
Okay, incredible groundwork. So we have the context, the brain areas, the definitions. How did these researchers actually set up the experiment to measure all this? What was the plan?
Their main goal was to see if there were clear differences in brain activation patterns, which areas lit up, how much, and in that functional connectivity, the communication, during a creative task, comparing the SAT group and the HEC group.
And they used that specific brain imaging technique, FNIS.
Right, functional near-infrared spectroscopy. And their core hypothesis, their prediction, was that the SAT group would show differences, specifically reduced brain activity, especially when they were forced to overcome those semantic constraints we talked about, when they really had to fight the obvious.
Makes sense. So who were the participants? How did they find these SAT and HC groups?
They started big, screening over 500 university students aged 18 to 25. They used a standard questionnaire, the Smartphone Addiction Scale, or SAS, to measure everyone's level of potential addiction.
And then they picked the extremes.
Essentially, yes, it's a common method. They took the students scoring on the top 27% on the SS, those with the highest addiction tendency, and that formed the SAT group. Ended up being 24 people.
Okay.
Then they took students scoring the bottom 27%, the ones with the lowest addiction tendency, and they became the healthy control, or HEC group. Also 24 people. So two groups, matched in size, but clearly different on that key measure of smartphone addiction tendency.
Were they similar otherwise? Age, intelligence, that sort of thing? You need to rule out other differences.
Absolutely crucial. And they did. No significant age difference. The SAT group, as expected, had way higher SAS scores, like 146 versus 70 on average, a huge difference. Interestingly, the SAT group also scored higher on anxiety measures, which sometimes goes along with addiction, but there were no significant differences in depression or general intelligence.
Good.
Plus, everyone was right-handed, had normal vision, and critically, no history of psychiatric issues or other addictions. That helps ensure the differences they found were likely linked to the smartphone addiction tendency, not something else.
Right, clean comparison. So they have the groups. How did they actually measure creativity in the lab? What was the task? You mentioned the AUT before.
Yes, the alternate uses task, AUT. It's a workhorse in creativity research. You get an object, say newspaper, and you have to list as many unusual or original uses for it as possible in a set time.
But they added that special twist to really test the overcoming constraints idea, didn't they?
Exactly. This was the clever part, central to their design. It happened in stages. First, a learning stage. Participants learned 6 specific objects and their 2 most common uses. Like, for brick, they'd learn build wall and break window. The goal was to really drill in those dominant associations to create the semantic constraint for those items.
So reinforcing the obvious to make it harder to think beyond it later. Smart.
Yep. Then came the consolidation stage, basically a memory test. They had to recall those common uses they just learned. Get it wrong, repeat until you get it right. This just hammered home those common associations even more, made the constraint stronger.
Okay, setting the stage, then the main experiment.
Right, the formal experimental stage. Here, they did the AUT using the FNIRS scanner, but under 2 different conditions. First, the constraint condition. They were given the objects they'd already learned the common uses for. So to be creative, they had to actively fight against those freshly reinforced, obvious ideas. This was the real test of overcoming constraints.
The mental heavy lifting part.
Exactly. Second, the unconstrained condition. They got new objects they hadn't learned common uses for. Here, thinking could be more free-flowing, less burdened by those pre-learned constraints. They also had a simple control task, just recalling a common use to get a baseline brain activity reading.
And measuring performance. How do you score creativity? Is it just counting ideas?
They use 3 standard metrics. Fluency. Yep, that's basically the total number of valid ideas you generate. Pretty straightforward. Flexibility, this looks at how many different categories your ideas fall into. So thinking of a brick as a weapon, a tool, and a piece of art shows more flexibility than just thinking of 10 different ways to build things with it.
Okay, variety matters.
Definitely. And then the big one, originality. This was assessed using the consensus assessment technique, COSIDO-T. 3 experts independently rated every single idea on a 1 to 5 novelty scale. It's considered a very robust way to measure originality because it relies on expert agreement.
And did the experts agree? Was the scoring reliable?
extremely reliable. The stats they reported, these things called intra-class correlation coefficients, or ICCs, were super high, 0.92 for originality, 0.91 for flexibility. That means the experts were very consistent in their judgments. We can trust those scores.
Great. So solid behavioral measures. Now, the brain scans the FNIRS. How does that work, and why choose it over something like fMRI?
FNIRS works by shining near-infrared light into the scalp and measuring how much light is absorbed or scattered back. This tells you about changes in blood flow and specifically the concentration of oxygenated hemoglobin HBO in the underlying brain tissue. More HBO generally means more brain activity.
Okay.
They had 43 of these measurement channels placed mainly over the prefrontal cortex, and those temporal regions we know are key for creativity. As for YFNRS, a huge advantage here is that it's safe, portable, and much, much quieter than an fMRI machine.
Ah, the noise factor. I can see how trying to be creative inside a giant banging magnet might be tricky.
Exactly. fMRI environments can be really restrictive and noisy, potentially stifling the very spontaneous thought processes they wanted to measure. FNIRS allows for a more natural, less disruptive setting, which is much better for capturing genuine creative thinking.
Good point. So they collected all this behavioral and brain data. How did they sift through it all to find the patterns?
They threw a whole statistical toolkit at it, things like ANOVA to compare group averages, time series analysis to see how activity changed over the 30 seconds of the task, sophisticated functional connectivity analyses like PPI during the task, and resting state correlations to map out the communication pathways, and even mediation analysis to see if, say, reduced activity in one area could explain the link between addiction scores and creativity scores. A really thorough approach.
Sounds incredibly comprehensive. All right, the moment of truth. After all that meticulous work, what did the results actually show? Let's unpack these findings. What happened behaviorally first?
The behavioral results were stark. Right off the bat, the smartphone addiction tendency group, the SAT group, performed significantly worse than the healthy control group. And this wasn't just on one measure, it was across the board.
Wow. Once on all three: fluency, flexibility, and originality.
Yep. Lower fluency, meaning fewer ideas generated overall. Lower flexibility, meaning their ideas were less varied, stuck in fewer categories, and lower originality, meaning their ideas were rated as significantly less novel or creative by the experts. The p-values were all significant, indicating these weren't just chance differences, it was a clear pattern. SAT was linked to poorer creative performance.
That's quite impactful. Fewer ideas, less varied ideas, less original ideas.
Okay. And what about that semantic constraint manipulation? Did it work? Did making people learn common uses actually make it harder to be creative?
It absolutely did, which validates their experimental design. In the healthy control group, their flexibility scores were significantly lower when they were in the constraint condition compared to the unconstrained condition. That p=0.001 shows it was a strong effect. So even for the healthy folks, fighting those pre-learned ideas made it harder to think flexibly.
Exactly. It confirms the constraint was real and required extra cognitive effort to overcome. It wasn't just an imaginary hurdle.
And did the SAT group struggle even more with originality under constraint? You mentioned a subtle trend.
Behaviorally, for originality, the interaction wasn't quite statistically significant in the same way flexibility was. But there was a clear trend. The SAT group's originality scores tended to be lower under constraint. The researchers suggested maybe the 30-second time limit was just too short to fully capture the originality deficit behaviorally. Sometimes truly novel ideas take a bit longer to surface.
Ah, okay.
But, and this is crucial, the brain findings, the neural data, strongly backed up this idea that the SAT group struggled more under constraint. The brain changes were much clearer.
Okay, let's get into that neural data. What did the FNIRS scans reveal about brain activation? Where was the brain working or not working?
The differences in brain activation were really quite striking. Overall, the SAT group showed significantly weaker activation compared to the HC group in a whole network of key brain regions vital for creative thinking.
Which areas specifically?
We're talking reduced activity in the right medial prefrontal cortex, left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, left inferior frontal gyrus, all key parts of that PFC executive control hub. Also, weaker activity in the right temporoparietal junction, part of the DMN, right superior temporal gyrus, and right middle temporal gyrus. Those temporal areas crucial for semantic processing and making connections.
So generally less brain power being deployed across the board in these critical creative zones for the SAT group.
That's a good way to put it. Less engagement overall.
And was this lack of engagement particularly bad when they faced that semantic constraint, when the mental lifting got heavy?
Yes. This is where the hypothesis really hit home. Looking within the SAT group, their brain activation in several of those key regions, right MPFC, left DLPFC, left IFG, right TPJ, was even weaker when they were in the constraint condition compared to the unconstrained condition.
Wow. So their brains seem to check out even more when the task demanded they actively fight against those familiar ideas.
It strongly suggests that, yes, they struggled more to mobilize the necessary neural resources when faced with that specific creative challenge of overcoming mental inertia. Their cognitive control systems seemed less responsive to that demand.
That really points to a core difficulty in breaking out of established thinking patterns. And didn't they pinpoint one specific area acting as a kind of crucial link, a mediator?
They did. The left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, DLPFC, emerged as a key mediator. What that means is that the reduced activity in this specific area actually accounted for a significant chunk of the negative relationship between the smartphone addiction scores and the originality performance in the SAT group.
So a less active left DLPFC is a big part of why higher smartphone addiction tendency leads to less originality.
Exactly, because the DLPFC is so critical for cognitive control, for shifting your focus, for suppressing those automatic responses. Its reduced engagement makes it harder to ignore the obvious and search for the novel. This finding fits perfectly with other research showing impaired executive function in smartphone addiction. It's a potential mechanism.
Okay, so less activity overall, especially under constraint, and the DLPFC seems key. Now, the time series analysis looking at when this activity changed during the task, you said that revealed something about cognitive fatigue.
This was fascinating and really paints a picture of mental endurance or lack thereof. In the healthy control group, yes, their PFC activity did decrease, but typically only in the later part of the 30-second task window, say around 16-20 seconds in.
Suggesting even healthy brains get a bit tired after sustained creative effort, like the end of a sprint.
Right, resource depletion is normal. But the contrast with the SAT group was dramatic. Their DLPFC activity dropped much, much earlier, starting between 6 and 15 seconds into the task, and this period of reduced activity lasted longer.
Whoa, so they hit the wall way sooner and stayed there longer.
That's the strong implication. It suggests individuals with SAT experience this cognitive control exhaustion, this mental fatigue, much earlier and for more prolonged periods during creative tasks, especially when fighting constraints. They just seem to run out of the mental energy needed for creativity much faster. That early burnout is a huge potential barrier.
That's a powerful image, the creative engine sputtering out early. Okay, so activity levels are down, fatigue sets in sooner. What about the communication between brain regions, that functional connectivity? Was the orchestra playing together properly?
This adds another layer, suggesting the problem isn't just individual regions, but the network coordination. Looking at task-based connectivity, how regions talk during the AUT, the SAT group showed weaker connections. Specifically, weaker functional connectivity between that key left DLPFC, part of the ECN, and other important players like the left IFG, also ECN, and the right TPJ, part of the DMN.
So the executive network wasn't communicating well within itself, and it wasn't communicating well with the default mode network. That sounds like a recipe for disjointed thinking.
It really does. And drilling down further, within the SAT group, those connections DLPFC to MTG, DMN, and DLPFC to IFG, ECN, were even weaker under the constraint condition. This is critical because, as we discussed, that smooth collaboration between the focused ECN and the associative DMN is thought to be essential for creativity. Weaker connections mean less effective teamwork between the systems needed to both suppress old ideas and generate new ones.
Like different sections of the orchestra being out of sync, especially during the difficult parts of the music. And did this communication breakdown show up even when they weren't doing the task in the resting state?
Yes, and that suggests a more fundamental baseline difference. Even at rest, the SAT group showed weaker connectivity within the temporal region, DMN, and also weaker connectivity between the prefrontal, ECN areas, and temporal regions, DMN areas. Like the baseline communication infrastructure was less robust.
And did this baseline connectivity actually predict how creative they were?
It did. Stronger resting state connectivity in these key networks was linked to better AUT performance in both groups. So better baseline wiring equals better creativity generally. But importantly, within the SAT group, higher smartphone addiction scores were directly correlated with weaker connectivity in these crucial brain circuits.
So the stronger the addiction tendency, the weaker the baseline communication between these creative networks, and the poorer the creative output. It all ties together.
It really does. The overall picture from the connectivity data, both task and rest, points to smartphone addiction tendency being associated with weaker communication between the brain networks, vital for navigating creative challenges, overcoming constraints, and forming novel links. It suggests a brain less adept at dynamically shifting between focus control and spontaneous thought, which is the heart of creative flexibility.
Okay, let's pull all these threads together now. What are the major takeaways from this deep dive? And most importantly, what does this mean for, us, the people listening?
Well, synthesizing it, the study gives us pretty clear behavioral evidence. A tendency towards smartphone addiction links directly to poorer creative performance. Fewer ideas, less varied ideas, less original ideas. That's the output.
And the why behind that output, the neural story.
Neurally, this shows up as reduced brain activity in those key command centers, the prefrontal cortex and temporal regions needed for cognitive control and semantic processing. The study really nailed that the overcoming semantic constraints part of creativity, breaking free from the obvious, is especially hard hit. SAT individuals seem to struggle more to suppress the familiar and retrieve the novel.
And it's not just activity in regions, but the connections between them.
Exactly. That functional connectivity between the executive, ECN, and default mode, DMN networks, which need to work together for creativity, is significantly weaker. And then there's that kicker from the time series analysis, the suggestion of earlier and longer-lasting cognitive fatigue. Their creative mental gas tank seems to empty faster.
So why should someone listening right now care about this? This isn't just academic neuroscience, is it?
Not at all. This highlights a tangible potential impact on a core human ability, creativity. And creativity isn't just for artists. It's vital for everyday problem solving, for adapting to change, for innovation at work, for finding solutions in our personal lives. How often do you need a fresh idea or a different approach? This research suggests our phone habits might be quietly undermining that very capacity.
And it's maybe not just for people who'd label themselves addicted. Even just heavy, constant use might have subtle effects.
That's a really important point. Even if you don't meet some clinical threshold for addiction, these findings about altered brain activity, weakened connections, earlier fatigue, they could offer clues about how continuous, unfiltered smartphone engagement might subtly chip away at your own cognitive flexibility, your ability to think truly divergently. It really forces us to question the balance between convenience and cognitive well-being. What are we trading off?
A crucial question for our times. Now, every study has its limits. What did the researchers acknowledge as areas for future work?
They were clear about a few things. One was that they didn't differentiate between types of smartphone addiction, like is gaming different from social media scrolling and its impact on creativity. That could be explored.
Makes sense. Different apps engage the brain differently.
Right. Also, they focus specifically on creative idea generation with the AUT. But creativity also involves other things, like insight problem solving, those aha moments, or evaluating and refining ideas. Those weren't tested here. And finally, FNIRS, well, great for being quiet, can't see into really deep brain structures like the hippocampus, which we know are also involved in creativity and memory. So using fMRI in the future could give an even more complete brain picture.
Good points for future research to build on. So wrapping this up, what's the core message, the essential insight from this deep dive?
The core insight is that this study provides compelling neuroimaging evidence, suggesting that a tendency towards smartphone addiction can significantly impair our creative thinking. It seems to do this by dampening activity and weakening connections in the very brain networks we rely on to generate novel ideas and, crucially, to break free from mental ruts. It points to a real cognitive cost associated with our deep entanglement with these devices.
Which leaves us all with a pretty powerful question to reflect on. In this hyper-connected world, as our dependence on smartphones just keeps growing, what unintended trade-offs might we be making with our fundamental human capacity for original thought and flexible problem-solving? And maybe the more proactive question is, what steps could you consciously take to carve out some cognitive space, to nurture and protect your own creative mind?
Definitely something worth pondering the next time that notification pulls you away.